Internet, and welcome back to my reviews of the Mission Impossible movies leading up to Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning. Last time we covered Mission Impossible 2, and now, my mission, should I choose to accept it, is to take a look at the third entry in a film franchise that gets better with each new entry. And this is one of my personal favorites, Mission Impossible 3. Released on May 5th, 2006, Mission Impossible 3 is directed by J.J. Abrams in his directorial debut. J.J. Abrams is best known for directing Star Trek from 2009, Star Trek Into Darkness, Super 8, Star Wars The Force Awakens, and Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker. I talk about how divisive the Star Wars sequel trilogy is, but I'm gonna save that for another time. David Fincher, who previously directed Alien 3 and Fight Club, was originally going to be the director for Mission Impossible 3, but dropped out due to creative differences. Around this time, J.J. Abrams was known for television work rather than film, and he ultimately signed on to direct Mission Impossible 3 after Tom Cruise watched the first 2 seasons of Alias, which was an ABC series that J.J. Abrams worked on. Let's just say that J.J. Abrams' career as a film director has a bit of a mixed run, particularly 2009 Star Trek, which was filled to the brim with lens flares, and his 2 Star Wars movies, especially the complete mess known as The Rise of Skywalker. Mission Impossible 3 shows Ethan Hunt, played once again by Tom Cruise, retired from fieldwork for the IMF, and is forced back into active duty to pursue elusive arms dealer Owen Davian, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. Philip Seymour Hoffman is also known for portraying Plutarch Heavensbee in 3 Hunger Games movies, until his death at age 46 in 2014 from combined drug intoxication. Also starring in this movie is Simon Pegg as Benji Dunn, who would later become an important member of Ethan's team in future installments. Benji is who I consider to be the comic relief of the Mission Impossible series, since Simon Pegg is a well-known comedian known for such classics as Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, The World's End, his role as Montgomery Scott in 2009 Star Trek Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond, Ogden Morrow in the film adaptation of Ready Player One, and even as Huey's father in The Boys. There's Michelle Monaghan as Julia Meade, Ethan's fiancée and a nurse. Michelle Monaghan would later reprise the role in Ghost Protocol and Fallout. Maggie Q and Jonathan Rhys Meyers as IMF agents who join Ethan on important missions. And Lawrence Fishburne as the IMF director who probably replaced Anthony Hopkins between the second and third movies, but we don't know for certain. There's Billy Crudup as John Musgrave, the IMF director of operations who was later revealed to be a traitor. There's also Kerry Russell as Lindsay Ferris, an IMF agent who kicks the bucket in the film's opening scene in a pretty gruesome way that I will get to in just a moment. As always, this video will contain spoilers to Mission Impossible 3, so if you've not seen it yet, please click away from this video and check out the film for yourself either on DVD, Blu-ray, 4K, or even Paramount+. But before we go through a rundown of the plot, I did mention in my review of Mission Impossible 2 that the funny face that Sean Ambrose makes is worthy of a whole bunch of memes. Not only did I check the comment sections, but I also made some of my own memes too. Enjoy! Eugene opening his taco pantry, finding them gone. Silver whenever Shadow opens his mouth to talk. When you play through Sonic Adventure and you make it up to Big the Cat's story. When you drink an entire 2-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper in 30 seconds. Every Mario Party loss ever. Every time David makes a pun. When you Google Sonic X Shadow and you forgot to include Generations at the end. When you finish your Chipotle burrito in 10 minutes and you're too far away from the restroom. When you think you're finally getting a summer break from all the work during college, only to be assigned homework that's due before the start of the next semester. Well, I'm glad I got that out of the way. Now let's get started before this whole video self-destructs. Oh, we're still going? Thank God, because this video would have been cut off had it self-destructed. I just hope Deadpool hasn't been planting C4 in random places. Okay, I don't see any C4, so let's get started. This is Mission Impossible 3. J.J. Abrams uses shaky cam quite a lot throughout this movie, particularly the opening scene where Ethan Hunt is tied up by Owen Davian, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, as the most twisted, psychotic, and dare I say frightening villain in the entire Mission Impossible series. Ethan has an explosive charge planted in his head. And you know how I said in my review of Mission Impossible 2 that every single movie in the series has a MacGuffin of sorts? In Mission Impossible 3, it's something called the Rabbit's Foot. The Rabbit's Foot is a biological hazard of significant destructive power. Not exactly Chimera from Mission Impossible 2, but if it falls into the wrong hands, it's game over for not only the IMF, but the whole world as well. So David threatens Ethan, saying that if he doesn't cough up the location of the Rabbit's Foot, his fiancée Julia, played by Michelle Monaghan, dies. And through this opening scene, we see that Owen Davian takes shit from nobody, and is willing to murder those that Ethan loves and cares about, and he's not one to be fucked with. When it comes to fictional villains, there's 3 different kinds. The funny cartoony villains like Jim Carrey's portrayal of Dr. Robotnik in the Sonic the Hedgehog movies, and the wet bandits from Home Alone. The villains with sympathetic motivations behind their plans to do what they did, like Killmonger from Black Panther. And finally, there's the cold-blooded villains who have zero redeeming qualities and are just straight-up evil, like President Snow from The Hunger Games, Dolores Umbridge from Harry Potter, Joffrey Baratheon and Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones, and Owen Davian in Mission Impossible 3. I will give props to Philip Seymour Hoffman for his portrayal of the most cold-blooded Mission Impossible villain ever. He may just be one of my favorite movie villains of all time. Not the kind who would sing Be Prepared or Poor Unfortunate Souls, or a campy Bond villain monologuing to the hero about their evil plan. No, he will fuck you up for life in more ways than one. And that's why Philip Seymour Hoffman was perfectly cast in this movie. And given how intense the opening scene is, I wonder what the R-rated cut would have looked like. Probably blood splatter, and Tom Cruise dropping more F-bombs than Ellie in The Last of Us, or Sonic in the Sonic and Sonic series. But the F-word isn't used in the Mission Impossible series until Henry Cavill abides by the one fuck rule in Mission Impossible Fallout.
Why'd you have to make this so fucking complicated?
The one time where Superman turns into Homelander, and the reason why Henry Cavill's mustache was removed with CGI on the set of Justice League. But more on that when it comes time for me to talk about Mission Impossible Fallout. Once Owen Davian pulls the trigger, we get our obligatory opening title sequence along with the iconic Mission Impossible theme song. But don't worry folks, Julia is still alive after seemingly being shot. This same exact scene plays later on in the climax of the film. We then cut to some time ago with Ethan engaged to Julia having some kind of house party, where Ethan is retired from IMF fieldwork and living a happy life after saying goodbye to Naya Nordhoff Hall after his vacation with her at the end of Mission Impossible 2. But all that goes to shit when he gets a phone call during the house party, and he meets up with a contact at a 7-Eleven of all places, coming up with an excuse to his fiancée saying they ran out of ice. Talk about unnecessary product placement, am I right? At this 7-Eleven, we meet John Musgrave, played by Billy Crudup. He's the director of operations at the IMF, until we see him for the backstabbing dickhead he really is. Musgrave gives Ethan a mission, should he choose to accept it. Agent Lindsay Ferris, played by Kerry Russell, has disappeared. She's a protege of Ethan's, and they have a very close relationship. And the self-destructed tape in this entry in the Mission Impossible series is a Kodak camera because those cheap disposable cameras were very common in 2006. And if you want a career in photography, you definitely don't want to use those cameras, because if your portfolio exists of photos of pigeons in a park taken with a cheap disposable camera, you're not going to be hired for the local newspaper. It turns out that Agent Ferris was going after Owen Davian and was captured. His mission, should he choose to accept it, head to Berlin, Germany to rescue Agent Ferris along with Luther Stickle, played once again by Ving Rhames, and two other agents played by Maggie Q and Jonathan Rhys Meyers. At this point in the movie, Julia has no idea that Ethan is a spy working for the IMF, so he has to come up with an alibi saying that he needs to go on a business trip for a while. The mission to extract Lindsay in Berlin goes accordingly, and the team is able to obtain 2 damaged laptops. But unfortunately, as they're about to book it out of there, we see that there's an explosive pellet planted in Lindsay's head. Ethan tries to disarm it with a defibrillator, but it detonates, killing Lindsay. But since it's a PG-13 film, and not the Suicide Squad or The Boys, there's no blood splatter or exploding heads. Instead, it's a really unsettling image of what it looks like to have your brain implode. I don't want to show it here as it would result in more people vomiting out their nachos than your average screening of Terrifier 3, and my channel being demonetized. And I don't want either of those scenarios to occur, thank you very much. Ethan's mission all throughout this movie isn't just about saving the world, it's personal. And the only times where James Bond's missions become personal is in Timothy Dalton's second and last Bond film License to Kill, and Daniel Craig's second Bond film Quantum of Solace. Both License to Kill and Quantum of Solace involve Bond wanting revenge after the people he cared about got hurt or worse. And Mission Impossible 3 is no different. One of the people who was closest to Ethan got her brains blown out by an explosive charge planted in her head. And at the very beginning of the movie, his own wife is threatened. And here, we see a side of Ethan that was clearly absent from the first 2 movies. A sensitive side. I mean, yes, we kinda saw it with Brian De Palma's Dutch angles in the first movie. But here, we actually see him shed a tear and allow him to act, not just crazy stunt this, punch and shoot that. All in all, Mission Impossible 3 is what I consider to be the most underrated entry in the franchise. Because we see a side of Ethan Hunt that we don't get to see often, and the action is the most exciting in any of the movies, and so are his crazy stunts. But with later entries with subtitles instead of numbers, be it Roman numerals or just regular old numbers, the stunt work goes above and beyond, and it all started with Mission Impossible 3. Why there is no Oscar category for best stunt work, I haven't the slightest clue. The 2024 film The Fall Guy starring Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt shows how stunt performers are the unsung heroes of Hollywood and don't get the credit they deserve. Even though Tom Cruise did all of his own stunts in Mission Impossible, despite him being well into his 60s as of this video's upload. So after the inside of Lindsay's head proceeds to
blow up into smithereens and spew my tiny symphony,
Ethan and Musgrave are reprimanded by IMF Director Lawrence Fishburne for botching the whole operation, resulting in the death of Lindsay. And we see just how close Ethan and Lindsay were as she was being laid to rest. He trained her as his own protege, as if Ethan was a Jedi Master and she was his Padawan. And Ethan later discovers that she actually sent Ethan a postcard before she was captured by Davian. And there's a microdot under the stamp. That means there's an encrypted message that the sender doesn't want anyone else to know about. Ethan and Luther don't know what to make of the microdot, so they consult tech expert Benji, played by Simon Pegg, who would later go on to become a series regular. In regards to the 2 damaged laptops that were retrieved in Berlin, Benji was able to gather enough data to know that Davian is headed to Vatican City to obtain the Rabbit's Foot, which, like I mentioned, is a biological weapon of major destructive power. Julia, like I said, is a nurse, and Ethan sees her one more time before going on a top-secret mission. She doesn't find out the truth about Ethan being an IMF agent until practically the end of the movie. And so, they get married at the hospital's chapel because they wanted to get it out of the way before Ethan goes on his mission. And clearly they didn't have time to get her a wedding dress, so she just wears her hospital scrubs, while Ethan just showed up as he is. By God! That's the most impromptu wedding since Will Turner and Elizabeth Swann getting married during a huge battle in Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. Ethan then proposes to his team to capture Davian at the Vatican before he can sell the Rabbit's Foot to an unknown buyer. And how do they propose to do that, you may ask? By having Ethan use a Scooby-Doo disguise to disguise himself as Davian. And so, they head to Rome in a DHL delivery truck. Another example of blatant product placement in this movie. Next thing you know, Ethan will open a bag of Doritos, drink a can of Dr. Pepper, and listen to American Idiot by Green Day on his iPod, since iPods were a thing back in 2006. Ethan makes it over the wall of the Vatican after disabling a security camera following a diversion created by him and Jonathan Rhys Meyers. And he literally says, and I shit you not, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall.
Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall.
And you want to know what's funnier? Ethan Hunt uses that exact same quote in LEGO Dimensions whenever he and Homer Simpson are both on the toy pad. A lot of Ethan Hunt's missions involve stealth, hence the Scooby-Doo disguises, and finding clever ways to bypass security cameras. Meanwhile with Metal Gear Solid, our guy Snake sometimes hides in a cardboard box. I've never actually played Metal Gear Solid, but I am familiar with playing as Snake in Super Smash Bros. But I can sort of see the similarities between Mission Impossible and Metal Gear Solid when it comes to stealth missions. And the way the IMF creates Scooby-Doo masks and disguises is through 3D printing technology. All you need to do is capture a few images of the person's face and get a match on their voice. Not just do a spot-on impression of the person like your average comedian, or in my case, a voice actor voicing characters such as Sonic and Sonic. This happens when Ethan disguises himself as Davian, as the real Davian goes into the bathroom to clean a wine spill on his shirt as a diversion caused by Maggie Q. Ethan beats the piss out of him and forces him to read an index card with a microphone concealed so that his voice can be copied as part of his disguise. And the voice reader takes a bit of time in order for it to work. And after a close call with a security guard, the voice reader is successful. So that means he sounds like Philip Seymour Hoffman and not Tom Cruise. The whole mission goes accordingly, and the IMF team is able to successfully capture Davian, and they book it out of there. And on the plane back to IMF headquarters, Davian isn't fazed by Ethan's interrogation, and he proceeds to threaten him and those he holds dear to his heart, like any cold-blooded villain would. While Ethan interrogates him about the Rabbit's Foot, he just continues to manipulate him in such a frightening performance coming from Philip Seymour Hoffman. And so, Ethan snaps and drags him over to the back of the plane and threatens to drop him, but Luther talks him out of it because they need him alive. As soon as Davian is brought to the United States, we learn that the microdot on Lindsay's postcard contains a video message warning that Lawrence Fishburne is not who we think he is. She claims that he's working for Davian after a call was made from his office, but we later learn that Lawrence Fishburne is innocent, that is actually John Musgrave who is working for Davian, but more on that in a bit. After listening to Lindsay's message, the IMF crew is ambushed on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge by people who extract Davian in an intense firefight that gives Captain America the Winter Soldier a run for its money, and thus, Davian gets away and Ethan is beyond fucked. Oh, and this movie also has a brief appearance from Aaron Paul as Ethan's brother-in-law. I mean, he's only in a couple scenes, but this was a couple years before he starred as Jesse Pinkman in Breaking Bad. After realizing that Julia's life is in danger, thanks to that phone call from Aaron Paul, Ethan books it to the hospital where she works as a nurse. But by the time he gets there, it's too late. Davian's men have her. Congratulations, Philip Seymour Hoffman! You are now officially fucked! Out of all the ways to piss off an IMF agent, threatening his loved ones, especially his spouse, will make him snap and he will be out for blood. Davian calls Ethan on the phone telling him that he is Julia, and that he's gonna hand the Rabbit's Foot over to him in 48 hours in exchange for her life. But then Ethan is captured by the IMF and questioned by Lawrence Fishburne about how he lost Davian on the bridge. And while he's tied up, Musgrave mouths to Ethan that the Rabbit's Foot is in Shanghai, that he intercepted Davian's call, and thus he aids in Ethan's escape by slipping a blade into his hands, allowing him to cut the ropes and book it out of the IMF building, all while using technology to make himself sound like Lawrence Fishburne and playing We Are Family by Sister Sledge on the intercom. Because We Are Family is apparently a perfect song to play while running away from authorities and being a fugitive from the IMF. We then cut to Shanghai, where the opening scene of Indiana Jones at the Temple of Doom took place. Ethan is looking for the Rabbit's Foot to give to Davian so he can save his wife. The rest of his team meets up with him, sent by Musgrave under the guise of another operation, because Ethan is now the IMF's most wanted fugitive. And so, Ethan breaks into the building where the Rabbit's Foot is secured, and he books it out of there with the Rabbit's Foot in his possession, after a bunch of close calls due to a malfunctioning parachute, and a literal game of Frogger across the busy streets of Shanghai, just to stop it from getting away from his grasp. Ethan goes alone in delivering the Rabbit's Foot over to Davian, and he's forced to take a tranquilizer. And so he wakes up in the scene where it all started, with Ethan tied up, an explosive charge in his head, and Davian threatening to kill Julia if he doesn't cough up the location of the Rabbit's Foot. And once he makes it to 10, he shoots Julia, except it's not the real Julia. Then comes the movie's most shocking twist.
Oh, Anna. If only there was someone out there who loved you.
That's right, folks! Musgrave is a traitor, not Lawrence Fishburne. For a good majority of the movie, Musgrave was helping Ethan go after Davian, when in reality, the slimy sumbitch is actually working for Davian, and he reveals that the woman who Davian shot is not the real Julia, but in fact Davian's translator who failed to protect him at the Vatican. The real Julia is alive and is being held hostage somewhere. The translator was wearing a mask to look like Julia as a way to force Ethan to confirm the authenticity of the Rabbit's Foot. Musgrave reveals to Ethan that he is indeed a mole, having arranged for Davian to sell the Rabbit's Foot to a terrorist group so the IMF could launch a preemptive strike against the Middle East. And he also asks Ethan about the microdot on Lindsay's postcard, framing Lawrence Fishburne when he was innocent. And after putting the real Julia on the phone, Ethan attacks the slimy sumbitch and escapes, desperately trying to save his wife from certain death. And he calls Benji and asks him to trace the call so he can find Julia, since Benji is the tech guy on Ethan's team. And the long continuous shot of Ethan running would sound a lot funnier with video game sound effects. Oh, but that's not the last of it. Any of these Mission Impossible stunts would sound funnier with video game sound effects, but I promise you'll see more of that later down the line. Ethan then finds Julia tied up, and then we have one final battle between Ethan and Davian in a heated fistfight that ends with Davian being hit by a truck. The most satisfying villain death since Joffrey got poisoned in Game of Thrones Season 4 Episode 2, and Hans Gruber being dropped from Nakatomi Plaza at the end of Die Hard. But then we're reminded that there's still an explosive in Ethan's head, so what does he do about it? MacGyver a makeshift defibrillator to deactivate the explosive, while also teaching Julia how to fire a gun, in which she shoots Musgrave in the fucking heart. And it's a good thing that Ethan married a nurse, because she successfully revives him after his heart stops following the shock from the MacGyver defibrillator to disarm the explosive. And it is then that he confesses the truth about him being an IMF agent. Back in the US, Lawrence Fishburne congratulates both Ethan and Julia before they go off on their honeymoon. But we still have no idea what the Rabbit's Foot really is, and we will never know. I'm giving Mission Impossible 3 an 8 out of 10. It is the most underrated entry in the Mission Impossible series by far. It's certainly an improvement over its two predecessors, especially Mission Impossible 2. Not only do I love the stunt work in the Mission Impossible films, but also the fact that they are all shot on location. In the case of this movie, it's Berlin, the Vatican, and Shanghai. That means they actually go to those locations and not create a soundstage in Los Angeles, made to look like a scene taking place in a faraway place, like say London or Tokyo. Tom Cruise gave it his all in this movie, and Philip Seymour Hoffman made an absolutely terrifying villain. It is very well paced, and there's practically no room for our main hero to catch his breath. That's an action film done right, like Die Hard, Speed, John Wick, and Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Nowadays, this movie doesn't get the credit it deserves, and it was overshadowed by later entries. But Mission Impossible 3 is definitely a high point for the Mission Impossible series. And the next one I'm going to talk about after this is actually the very first Mission Impossible movie I ever saw, and it was at the theater no less. With that said, stay tuned for my upcoming review of Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol coming soon, as well as all other projects and reviews coming soon. Till then, I'll see you all next time.